sea search is continuing for possible survivors of the Edmund Fitzgerald, a 729-foot ore carrier, which apparently broke apart and sunk.
Beneath the icy depths of Lake Superior lies the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, a ship that vanished without warning nearly 50 years ago.
About one of Michigan's most well-known shipwrecks. People still love talking about the Edmund Fitzgerald and the unanswered questions behind its sinking, so we took a closer look.
No distress call, no survivors, just silence. Now, for the first time, advanced AI has scanned the wreck with breathtaking precision. What it revealed was not just decay or twisted steel, but details that no one expected to see. How could one of the most respected ships on the Great Lakes disappear so suddenly? The answers hidden in this scan may rewrite the story of its final hours. The pride of the American side. When the SS Edmund Fitzgerald slid into the waters of the Detroit River in 1958, she wasn't just another freighter. At 729 feet long, she was the largest vessel ever to sail the Great Lakes, an engineering marvel designed to carry staggering loads of taconite iron ore from Duluth to the steel mills of Detroit and beyond. Built at the Great Lakes Engineering Works and owned by Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance, she was more than steel and rivets. She was a symbol of American industrial might. From the moment of her launch, the Fitzgerald drew attention. Her sleek proportions, white superstructure, and burgundy hull made her stand out against the gray waters of the lakes. Crowds gathered at ports just to watch her pass. Families lined bridges as she glided underneath, her horn echoing like a giant's voice across the water. Newspapers called her the Queen of the Great Lakes. Sailors simply called her the pride of the American side. But what truly set the Fitzgerald apart wasn't just her size or looks. It was the relationship between the crew and the ship. She had a reputation for speed, often breaking cargo delivery records, and her efficiency earned her a loyal roster of sailors. Many served aboard for years, a rarity in the transient world of maritime work. They trusted her strength, admired her performance, and believed in her safety. Her last captain in the years prior to her fate, Ernest McSorley, embodied this confidence. A veteran mariner nearing the end of his years, McSorley was known for his calm judgment and quiet authority. He had borne a great number of storms and ice and fog in his career and had built the respect of his fellow mariners. He was taking command of the Fitzgerald, thinking of it as one of the sturdiest ships afloat. This conviction was shared by his crew. For nearly 2 decades, it had suffered no casualties during its operations, never sustained a major breakdown, and failed to deliver its cargo. Life aboard the Fitzgerald was not without its difficulties, however. The Great Lakes, often mistaken by people on shore for an inland sea, would turn deadly within the hour. Storms could suddenly erupt without a hint of warning. Waves swelled like those of the ocean, ice clogged passages. Fog reduced visibility to nothing. Yet across all this, the Fitzgerald has endured over 700 voyages. Each subsequent safe return seemed to reinforce the idea that she was pretty much unsinkable. And this was how the presence became embedded in the cultural landscape of this area. Tourists were snapping shots as she passed through the Soo Locks. She was known to the children of port towns just by her silhouette. Later on, Canadian singer Gordon Lightfoot would immortalize her in song, creating a legend. But Fitzgerald was much more than a tale to tell in the years leading to her disastrous demise. She was alive, gliding through storms and sunsets, admired by thousands and loved by those who plied her decks. By the fall of 1975, she was still one of the most respected freighters on the lakes. Her hull was scarred from its years of hard labor, but she bore a reputation, and the reputation was pristine. She was solid. She was trustworthy. And to the men who boarded her for a run down to Detroit in early November, she was family. No one, crew, captain, or families on the shore waving her goodbye, could have guessed that it was the last time they would ever see her under sail. Yet on November 10th, 1975, as a storm unlike any other descended on Lake Superior, the legend of the Fitzgerald transformed from pride to mystery, because within hours she would vanish in silence. Vanished in silence. On November 9th, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin, loaded with more than 26,000 tons of taconite pellets bound for a Detroit steel mill. It was a routine voyage the ship had completed hundreds of times before. But this time, winter was tightening its grip on the Great Lakes. Weather reports warned of worsening conditions, though no one could have foreseen the monster that was forming over Lake Superior. By the next day, November 10th, the storm had grown into one of the worst in the lake's recorded history. Winds howled at more than 70 miles per hour. Waves climbed higher than 25 feet, slamming into the Fitzgerald's hull with brutal force. Snow and ice lashed across the deck, while visibility shrank to nearly nothing. Yet despite the ferocity of the storm, the Fitzgerald pushed forward, determined to make her run. Captain Ernest McSorley, calm and experienced, stayed in regular radio contact with another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, which was traveling nearby. Together, the two ships battled the tempest, keeping tabs on each other's positions through radar. Throughout the afternoon, McSorley reported problems: a bad list, a lost vent, and a damaged hatch cover. Still, his voice over the radio remained steady, composed, almost reassuring. To him, these were manageable issues. The Fitzgerald had endured storms before. They were holding their own. But Lake Superior was merciless that night. The wind screamed louder. The waves grew taller, slamming down with crushing weight. Ice built up on deck, adding more stress to the ship's already battered frame. At 7:10 p.m., the Anderson's crew heard McSorley's final transmission. His words were simple, confident, and chilling in hindsight. "We are holding our own." Moments later, the Fitzgerald disappeared from the Anderson's radar. No SOS signal, no distress flares, no pleading. She just vanished. 729 feet of steel, carrying 29 men, gone in an instant, swallowed by the storm and the lake, as if she had never existed. It was the quietest of noises. Most ships go down in storms and occasionally fight for the last currents of their lives, life-ending calls from a desperate last flare. Nothing. Resounding silence for the families of the 29 crewmen became the most haunting part of the tragedy. There are no last words, no last goodbyes, but only the void. The Coast Guard grabbed up the news much earlier and immediately took rescue actions. Helicopters, planes, and ships combed some sections of the storm-tossed waters of Lake Superior. But finding survivors proved futile. Just a few pieces of flotsam and wreckage, bits and parts of lifeboats, and oily streaks gliding sullenly on the surface. The Fitzgerald had gone down, taking with the entire crew. With the wreck finally located, they found it in two parts resting below the surface at 530 feet. The bow stood upright, half buried in the bottom sediments. The stern lay twisted, upside down, and battered close by. The tortured steel bore witness to the violence of her last moments. Yet, she continued to keep her secrets in death. How could a ship so strong sink almost immediately without warning, with a captain and crew experienced beyond doubt? Who did not send out a distress signal? And how could 29 men just disappear, leaving not even a trace? These questions would be etched into the minds and hearts of investigators, relatives, and historians for the next several decades. And so began nearly 50 years of debate, theories, and speculation. Because without survivors or a clear cause, the Edmund Fitzgerald became one of the greatest maritime mysteries of all time. The 50-year debate. When the Edmund Fitzgerald slipped beneath the surface of Lake Superior, she left behind not just wreckage, but questions that have haunted the maritime world for nearly 5 decades. With no survivors, no Mayday call, and only fragments of debris recovered, investigators were left with scraps of evidence and a mystery that refused to yield simple answers. What followed was not just an inquiry into a tragedy. It was a half-century debate filled with competing theories, official reports, and lingering suspicions. The first formal investigation came from the United States Coast Guard in 1977. Their conclusion seemed straightforward. The Fitzgerald's hatch covers failed during the storm. These massive steel covers, secured by clamps, were designed to keep water from flooding the cargo holds. According to the Coast Guard, powerful waves had torn them loose or left them improperly secured, allowing water to pour in. Once the forward holds flooded, the ship lost buoyancy, dragging her bow down until she vanished. It was a neat explanation, but not everyone accepted it. Families of the 29 lost crew members were outraged. To them, the Coast Guard's conclusion unfairly implied negligence on the part of the men who had sailed her. Captain McSorley was known as a meticulous, seasoned mariner. His crews were experienced, disciplined, and trusted. To suggest they had failed to secure basic hatch clamps felt like an insult to their professionalism and memory. For grieving families, it was easier to believe that nature itself, or hidden flaws in the ship's construction, were to blame. The National Transportation Safety Board offered an alternative theory. The board had theorized in the report that the Fitzgerald might have suffered from catastrophic structural failure on the surface that splits or fractures before she actually submerged. Years of pounding through storms and heavy loads might have weakened her steel. Under the unimaginable force of waves feeding 25 feet high and hurricane winds, she physically snapped apart. If that is indeed true, then it follows that the Fitzgerald's end was not crew error of any kind, but rather an unseen weakness that had developed over the years. There were other theories in the making. Some would have claimed that the vessel had grounded herself on a poorly charted shoal and torn her hull. Some argued that perhaps a rogue wave, more than 35 feet high, overpowered her at that moment. They all had merit. However, none was conclusively proven. The absence of distress signals, coupled with the suddenness of her disappearance, only served to further complicate the mystery. By the time the 1980s and 1990s came along, there were only small expeditions with their submersibles and some earlier sonar techniques to map the site of the wreck. Even then, the images produced were very grainy and did not reveal everything. They revealed the Fitzgerald split in two, bow upright and stern inverted, but without making pronouncements about the theory. Even though missing clamps, twisted steel, and torn vents were noted, these findings remained ambiguous without modern clarity. With the passage of time, the arguments started becoming about memory and not just mechanics. Maritime unions and families of victims and historians all held on to their versions. For a section, Fitzgerald was a victim of faulty design. For the other, it was a ship betrayed by an uncharted shoal or a freak of nature. Each of the theories came with an emotional undertaking of pride and pain, but through everything, it was clear. Speculation could not solve the riddle. To get to the heart of the mystery of November 10, 1975, technology would need to be far more advanced than divers and sonar were able to manage at that time. The wreck must tell its story, and only new tools would be able to make it speak. Nearly 50 years later, that moment finally came. came. Armed with underwater drones, high-powered cameras, and artificial intelligence, a new expedition dove into the depths, and what it revealed was unlike anything anyone expected. AI drone dive into darkness. Before dawn on a calm day in 2023, a research vessel hovered over the GPS coordinates of one of the Great Lakes' most infamous graves. Beneath that silent stretch of Lake Superior lay the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, resting 530 feet below the surface.
It was the largest ship to ever sink in the Great Lakes. Resting place is now 530 feet below the lake's surface, allowing only experienced divers with expensive submersible vehicles to visit her.
Nearly 50 years had passed since she vanished in the storm, yet the mystery of how she sank remained unsolved. This time, however, investigators weren't relying on grainy sonar scans or the naked eye of divers. They carried a new weapon, an AI-assisted underwater drone capable of mapping the wreck in unprecedented detail. This remotely operated vehicle, or ROV, wasn't like the ones used in the 1980s. Outfitted with 6 high-powered floodlights, 4K resolution cameras, multi-beam sonar, and AI-driven navigation software, the drone was designed to scan every rivet, beam, and fragment with surgical precision. Its thrusters allowed it to maneuver slowly and silently without disturbing the wreck, while its onboard processors created real-time 3D digital models of everything it saw. For the first time, the Fitzgerald could be studied not as a broken silhouette in murky water, but as a millimeter-accurate reconstruction, an underwater time capsule brought back to life. As the ROV descended into the cold, black water, its lights pierced through clouds of suspended sediment. Shapes began to emerge, fish darting through the gloom, twisted beams buried in silt, and then the unmistakable curve of the Fitzgerald's bow looming out of the darkness. The sight silenced the control room. After all these years, there she was, 729 feet of steel, half buried in the lake bed, preserved in eerie stillness. The cameras of the drone went along the bow. The paint had been gone for a long time, exposing the dull reddish color. Every surface had been covered for decades with sediment, but the structure was still hauntingly intact. It stood like a cathedral wall in the deep. The stern lay a little way from the sea floor, inverted and twisted, its hulking form mangled like the shadow of a once great ship. Together, the two halves narrated a creeping tale of violent destruction. It was actually in the details that the wonders of AI-enhanced scans left the investigators bewildered. As the ROV came close, the engineers noticed something very alarming. Along the forward cargo hatches, clamps that were supposed to be in place appeared bent and corroded, or were completely missing. These clamps were not just a few trivial fittings, they were essential for sealing the hatches against water. In their absence, every wave that gushed across the deck made it vulnerable to a wet cargo hold. Then, there was the moment that flipped the room. On one of the hatches, the cameras had found a huge hole where once had stood the vent pipe. There was not an airtight system. Rather, an open avenue lay directly into the lungs of the ship. The AI detection system spoke in detail about the various forms of damage. Something arbitrary to the human eye became recognizable as a uniform and widespread failure involving many hatches. It was not just one clamp missing, it was multiple clamps. It was not just wear and tear, it was catastrophic failure. The control room grew hushed as the unacceptability of the implication dawned on all present. Experts had debated rogue waves, shoals, and even structural flaws for decades. But this was nothing ambiguous, because witness clear high-definition clarity showed that Fitzgerald had been taking on water at an unrecognized rate by its crew. And as the scans continued, the story of the Fitzgerald's final moments came into sharper focus. Evidence that didn't just explain how she sank, but changed everything we thought we knew. Evidence that changed everything. At first, the drone's mission had been about documentation, mapping the wreck with millimeter accuracy, so researchers could better understand its condition. But what began as a simple survey soon turned into something far more significant. The closer the ROV moved along the Fitzgerald's deck, the clearer the evidence became. This wasn't just rust or decay. This was a structural failure that revealed how the ship had truly met its end. The most shocking discovery came from the cargo hatches. Each hatch was supposed to be secured by 22 heavy steel clamps, nearly 462 in total across the ship. These clamps formed the barrier between the storm's fury and the 26,000 tons of iron ore pellets inside the holds. Yet the drone's cameras revealed bent hardware, twisted backward, or clamps missing entirely. Some appeared to have been ripped away by brute force. Others were corroded or mangled as if they had failed long before the final voyage. Even worse was what the AI highlighted near the forward hatch. A vent pipe, which should have been firmly welded into place, was sheared off completely, leaving a 4-inch opening straight into the cargo hold. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like just another broken piece of steel. But to naval engineers watching the footage, it was nothing short of terrifying. That vent had become a funnel, channeling thousands of gallons of freezing lake water directly into the heart of the Fitzgerald. When experts ran simulations using the new data, the numbers were very chilling. Given that the egg hatch clamps, as well as the pen door, had gone, water could have been coming into the ship at a rate of over 4,000 gallons per minute. That is something even a hulking monster like the Fitzgerald could not survive for long. Within half an hour, she would have been dangerously unstable, her bow dragged down by the weight of water she was never designed to carry. This revelation now casts Captain McSorley's last words in a new, haunting light. "We are holding our own," he had said via radio, in what most probably seemed a calm demeanor. To many, that sounded like stoic confidence in the face of disaster. But the downward bird footage spoke otherwise. McSorley and his crew probably didn't know how nasty their situation had gotten. The Fitzgerald still looked somehow intact, still forging ahead. But underneath, unseen and unstoppable, she was already drowning. Interestingly, the scans suggested another discomforting truth. Some of the clamps don't seem original and are presumably retrofits or replacements added over the 17 years that the ship has been in operation. If that is true, this would imply that the Fitzgerald has a history of hardware issues that may have been silently compounding but were never fully addressed. The weakness of the ship did not just come into being on November 10, 1975. It may have been creeping in for years. The hatch cover theory had been derided for decades as speculative. Nothing else, their families claimed, had insulted men with seamanship. But now, for the first time, proof that could not be denied had emerged. With Ultra HD imagery and AI analysis, the drone had proven that the Fitzgerald hatches had been compromised long before radar stopped reading the ship. The ship had not been suddenly overwhelmed by a freak wave or sabotage. She had been subverted by something far more malign. Silent flooding creeping in with every crash of the storm. Yet if this discovery offered long-awaited answers, it also carried something darker, a warning. Because what the Fitzgerald's wreck revealed wasn't just about one ship's fate. It exposed vulnerabilities that could haunt every vessel of her era. Why experts are terrified. When the drone's footage and AI analysis were first presented to marine engineers and historians, the reaction was not triumph at finally solving a mystery. It was dread. Because the findings didn't just explain the Edmund Fitzgerald's fate, they revealed a vulnerability that shook confidence in the entire generation of Great Lakes freighters built during that era. To casual observers, a few missing clamps or a broken vent pipe might seem like minor wear and tear. But to naval architects, these details were catastrophic. The Fitzgerald's hatches and vents weren't secondary features. They were the ship's lungs and lifeline. With 26,000 tons of ore inside, the only thing keeping Lake Superior's waves from flooding the cargo holds was a thin line of steel clamps and vent fittings. The footage showed that once even a handful of these failed, the ship was doomed. And worse, it happened silently. This was the part that disturbed experts most. In storm sinkings, crews often have time to fight for survival, pumping water, sending mayday calls, launching flares. But the Fitzgerald gave none of those signs. Captain McSorley's last words, "We are holding our own," were genuine. He and his men did not know they were minutes from destruction. The ship didn't snap in half instantly. She drowned slowly, invisibly, beneath them. One marine architect put it bluntly, "This wasn't a ship breaking apart. This was a ship suffocating." One wreck was far-reaching indeed. The entire design of the Great Lakes freighters from the middle years of the 20th century hung on hatch clamps and vent structures. There were no secondary seals, no backup systems, and no double hulls like modern ocean carriers. If Fitzgerald could meet this fate, what was to become of her sisters still sailing in the decades afterward? Had others narrowly avoided her fate, unbeknownst to them? It sent chills through the shipping industry. More alarming was the insight that such weakness was usually not visible until it was too late. On days of inspection, clamps could have appeared quite serviceable. Vents could have seemed intact. But in the maniacal battering of a November storm, they might twist, shear, and disappear within minutes. It was beyond the crews to appraise the conditioning of every hatch in real time. Beneath the Fitzgerald, the water was flooding, unseen, unstoppable, and merciless. These discoveries opened up a lot of awkward questions in terms of oversight and regulation. Why were such ships built during their period unmanned by backup safety? Why hadn't inspectors sounded alarm bells over the possibility of primary hatch clamp failure after years of service? And most perish of all, if Fitzgerald was destined down that night, would any other freighter have suffered the torture under the same circumstances? For an agonizingly large number of their families, evidence was neither all damning nor sorrowful only. The proof cleared the crew of all blame, having failed in their duties. They did not abuse procedures. They did not sail recklessly. Rather, a vulnerability inherent in the ship let them down. This is terrifying for maritime engineers, as it implies that the issue is systemic, not just unique to the Fitzgerald. And what unsettles experts most is the possibility that the same silent flaws may still linger, hidden in the steel of other vessels that continue to sail today. And that led to one final, haunting question. If the Fitzgerald's sinking was preventable, what does it say about the institutions that let her sail? The questions left behind. The underwater scans of the Edmund Fitzgerald finally gave investigators the clearest answers they had been chasing for nearly half a century. Yet the answers didn't bring the peace many had hoped for. Instead, they opened doors to deeper, more unsettling questions. Questions about accountability, overlooked warnings, and whether this disaster could have been prevented long before November 10, 1975. For nearly 5 decades, the Fitzgerald existed in a haze of myth and speculation. Some believed she was claimed by a freak wave. Others argued she struck an uncharted shoal hidden beneath Superior's icy waters. Still others leaned into superstition, whispering that the ship carried a curse. These theories persisted because no one had clear proof, and the mystery filled the void. But the AI-assisted drone scans changed all of that. What was once legend has been replaced with hard evidence: missing hatch clamps, a shattered vent pipe, and visible signs of gradual flooding. The story was no longer about mystery or myth. It was about vulnerability. And that realization left a bitter taste. Because if the scans were right, the men aboard the Fitzgerald didn't perish in some unpredictable act of fate. They died because their ship wasn't as strong as everyone believed. They died because critical safety features had either been overlooked, allowed to degrade over time, or were never designed to withstand the storm that came for them. And that leads to the most haunting question of all. How could a vessel celebrated as the pride of the American side be allowed to sail with such hidden weaknesses? For the families of the 29 men lost that night,
a freighter carrying a crew of 29 disappeared on Lake Superior during a severe storm last night, and so far no survivors have been found. The freighter, the Edmund Fitzgerald, was transporting iron ore when it ran into high winds and 25-foot waves.
This truth was both a comfort and a wound. Comfort, because it shifted the blame away from their loved ones. For decades, some critics suggested that Captain McSorley or his crew had mishandled the storm or failed to secure the hatches properly. The scans now prove that wasn't the case. McSorley and his men hadn't failed in their duties. They were fighting a losing battle they couldn't even see. But the wound comes from knowing the tragedy wasn't inevitable. It was preventable. Had the clamps been inspected more rigorously? Had vent structures been reinforced? Had regulators demanded stronger safeguards? The Fitzgerald might have survived the storm, and those men might have returned home. Yet the questions are far from climaxing here with the Fitzgerald. It creates a rippling effect across the history of shipping on the Great Lakes. How many other freighters from the same era sailed with vulnerabilities hidden under decks? Were regulators truly oblivious of the risk? Or were they unwilling to disturb the flow of commerce upon which the steel industry depended? Did they underestimate the fury of Superior's storms? Or did they knowingly shave edges in the footsteps of building better, faster, cheaper? These questions now hang in shadow over the very legacy of Great Lakes shipping and refuse to fade away. Apart from those same institutions, there were issues even with those meant to find the truth. Why, nearly 50 years later, and with the help of AI scans, has what some very quiet engineers had suspected all along been confirmed? The theory as to the hatch covers was for the 1977 Coast Guard report, but it was widely taken as speculative. Now, with the footage being clearer than ever and the digital reconstructions, that same theory is vindicated. But the awful reality: they could have discovered that evidence decades ago so that changes could have been made to protect other ships and crews that travel the waters of Superior. And then came the emotional weight. The drone scans may have told how the Fitzgerald sank, but they did not soften the tragedy. They showed a ship silently drowning below her crew, who believed until the very last second that they were safe. They show how confidence can turn rapidly into catastrophe, that even the mightiest steel can be turned into nothing more than a finger by the relentless pressure of nature. The Edmund Fitzgerald wreck is no longer a grave. It is a message chiseled in rust and silence, a cautionary note to future generations that pride and reputation are never enough to defy the elements. Its final secret was more one of oversight than mystery, and that truth lingers as the most haunting revelation of all. The drone did more than rediscover a shipwreck. It forced us to witness a very painful reality. that sometimes history doesn't hide its lessons. We are the ones who don't see it until it is too late. The Edmund Fitzgerald story is still sending chills nearly 5 decades later. If this deep dive left you with questions, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more untold stories, and hit the bell so you never miss a discovery. And stay tuned. The next video on your screen uncovers another mystery where history and technology collide.